Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of many of MMA After Dark. I'm your host, Paul. UFC Fight Night Seattle officially in the books. We're going to get into all the fights on the main card, highlights from the prelims. I'm not going to go over every fight on the prelims, but some very big highlights from the prelims. And of course, the main event that ended with some controversy. We're going to get into all that, breakdown of that fight, every fight on the main card, and much more. Title implications, what it means for the winners, what it means for the losers. Thanks so much for joining me. Make sure you like and subscribe as you're watching. And let's start the very first episode of MMA After Dark. All right, guys, UFC Seattle Fight Night. The prelims, like I mentioned before, we're not going to get into every single fight on the prelims, but my goodness, how can we not talk about, in my mind, the absolute highlight of the prelims with Ricky Simón viciously knocking out a surging Javid Basharat, who I actually picked to win, to beat Ricky Simón in this contest. Every time I seem to pick Ricky Simón, he disappoints me. And before this fight was announced, I honestly thought this was going to be a layup for Javid Basharat. Their trajectories prior to this fight seemed to be going in different directions. Javid Basharat was a surging contender. A lot of people had him picked as kind of a dark horse contender to make some noise in the 10 to 15 range and even beyond maybe. But Ricky Simón had something to say about that with a vicious first round knockout that had Javid Basharat on the ground, and upon coming to, asking the referee repeatedly, what happened? What happened? What happened? Ricky Simón is deserving of respect. He had something to say about that, about everyone that picked. I believe Javid Basharat was the favorite coming into that contest, but Ricky Simón gets his flowers for the night. Javid Basharat, still a guy that I think could make some noise eventually in the bantamweight division, but tonight it belongs to Ricky Simón. So huge knockout for Ricky Simón, gets him back on track. A win that he very much needed. This is a guy that hasn't won in a few years. Certainly all the skills, all the capabilities, tough as nails, but he needed this win. And I think the matchmakers picked this as a layup for Javid Basharat, kind of a stepping stone to get him to inch a little bit closer to that 10 to 15 range in the bantamweight division. With a guy that can mix things up in there. And again, he still might get there, but for now, the night belongs to Ricky Simón. Vicious KO. If you haven't seen that yet, go back and give it a look. Candidate for knockout of the year? Obviously, the name value of these guys, sometimes we know how these things go when they give out these awards. Sometimes you got to have a strong name value attached to it, or even a number one contender fight or a championship fight attached to a knockout to kind of get that award. But I mean, if we're just looking at knockouts at face value, I mean, how can you not put that at least an early candidate for knockout of the year? Hats off to Ricky Simón. He got it done against a surging Javid Basharat. We had a lot of other good finishes on the prelims. We had Iwan Kuchlaba getting it done against Ibo Aslan. We had a good one with Nursultan Ruzaboyev finishing off McConaughey, making his debut. You kind of felt a little bad for McConaughey in the early promos prior to the fight. They had they were talking about his story and about how previously lost his job, and it seemed like he was getting this opportunity at a great time, but he just didn't have anything for Nursultan Ruzaboyev. He finished him pretty easily. McConaughey looked like it was a little, the moment was a little bit too big for him, maybe. And maybe too on short notice to add to that. But prelims, great. Prelims got us started off with some bangers, and fortunately, it carried into the main card. Nothing worse than when you have bangers on the prelims and then the opener of the main card is just a flat dud. But that was not the case, as Alonzo Minifield and Julius Walker delivered a sneaky banger of a fight. Not the most technical fight by any means. Julius Walker, a guy making his UFC debut against a pretty established Alonzo Minifield, a guy that's been around a long time, but certainly a dangerous guy, a guy that carries power in both of those hands. But he came to fight Julius Walker. The first round, he was very much pressuring Alonzo Minifield, had him backing up, really trying to finish that takedown. I thought he did a good job getting those takedown entries, but just had a hard time finishing. Props to Alonzo Minifield. But Walker, he showed some skills. He showed that he can bang. He showed that he has heavy hands. He shows that he can mix it up. I like that he was mixing it up multiple areas. He wasn't just head hunting. He was doing some head hunting, but he was also mixing it up to the body and to the legs more than Alonzo Minifield. But I do think Alonzo Minifield's ability to negate the takedown, keep things on the feet, is ultimately what got him the win, because in my mind, I think that Alonzo Minifield was landing the bigger shots, the heavier shots. Walker was landing some too, no question about it. The rounds were very close, but upon first watch, I did score it for Alonzo Minifield. But Walker showed that he's very much deserving to be in the mix. And for Minifield, that this was an important win for him, because you certainly don't want to lose your number by your name, that ranking, that all-important ranking, especially when you're barely hanging on at 15. You don't want to lose that to a guy that's making his debut at 6-0. But Walker showed that he can bang, and he showed that he is tough, man. He took some big shots from Alonzo Minifield, but hung in there, and it went to the decision. So props to both guys, props to Minifield. That was a much needed win for him, and Walker showed that he's going to be a force to reckon with. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Walker puts together moving forward. I think that he's got to work on that cardio a little bit and work on just finishing those takedowns, because there were some takedowns, there were some entries to the takedowns to where he had full grip, locked in on the double legs, but just couldn't seem to finish. But again, props to Alonzo Minifield for negating those. In real time, again, I did score it for Minifield, but I mean, if you had a card for Walker, I mean, shoot, who could blame you? I mean, the guy dished it out pretty well also. So that was a great fight to open up the main card. And then we move in. I'm going to bounce around a little bit, actually, because the next fight after the Minifield and Walker fight was Gene Silva versus Melsik Bagdasaryan. But I got a lot to say about Mr. Lord Silva. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I'm going to first talk about the Font and Matsumoto fight. Another great fight, another competitive fight. Rob Font showing at 39, I think he is now, that he can still get it done against an undefeated Gene Matsumoto. And Rob Font took that O from him this evening. Very impressive from Rob Font. I did not know that Rob Font joined his teammate, Calvin Kattar, in Canada at TriStar, training now with the famous Faraz Sahabi, the very famous world-renowned coach of the great George St. Pierre. And while we didn't really get to see a whole lot from Calvin Kattar in the Youssef Zalal fight, I think we did see that little switch paid off big for Rob Font. Rob Font, prior to this, was known as a guy that you could kind of take down and control. And while Gene Matsumoto did find success with the takedown, he really couldn't do much with it. And Rob Font put up some fight when Gene Matsumoto was trying to finish those takedowns. And like I said, although Gene did finish some of those takedowns, there was really little to no damage done on the ground by Gene Matsumoto, which primarily led to the fight being decided on the feet. And similar to the Alonzo Minifield and Walker fight, I did think that Rob Font landed the heavier shots in the rounds. And then visually, of course, in the third round, he opens up that big cut on Gene Matsumoto, got him gushing pretty good. And just the visual of it, I think could have swayed some of the judges' scorecards, because we know how important damage is in MMA. It's supposed to be the #1 criteria, and I know that can kind of vary from judge to judge, but if your guy's getting takedowns and just really doing nothing with it, and quite a few of those, I believe Rob Font was up pretty quick, kept things on the feet. Rob Font looked fresh coming into that third round, but great fight, competitive fight, but huge for Rob Font, saying, I'm not going anywhere, holding on to that ranking and holding strong in the top 10. Good win for Rob Font. Gene Matsumoto is going to continue to be around. I did pick Rob Font to get this done. I think there's a trend now of some of these vets fighting some of these surging contenders, saying, oh no, not so fast. Not so fast. A lot of these veterans got something to say to some of these surging young contenders. So, moving on. I'm going to backtrack now, because the fight prior to this was the Gian Lord Silva against Melsik Bagdasaryan. I think some people forgot about Gene Silva. Last time we saw him was against Drew Dober. Handed him that nasty, nasty cut that ultimately led to a doctor stoppage. But Gene Silva was en route to get the victory regardless, in my opinion. That was a huge win for him. Prior to that, we saw him last summer against Charles Jourdain. Very good fighter. I mean, that's a good little streak right there to have finished a Charles Jourdain, and then I know it's doctor stoppage from in the Drew Dober fight, but very impressive what he was able to do to Drew Dober at lightweight, coming up from featherweight to lightweight to fight a Drew Dober that I believe a short notice fight, if I'm remembering correctly, sustained some injuries during the fight, and we hadn't seen him since. And we've heard plenty about the Fighting Nerds and that amazing team that's just surging right now, from Caio Borralho to Carlos Praches to Marisa Hufi, and of course now we were reminded about the Lord, Gene Lord Silva, who viciously finished Melsik Bagdasaryan. This looked like a mismatch. Melsik Bagdasaryan didn't have a whole lot for Gene Silva. I'm not a huge fan of the constant dapping up and the high-fiving and then the pausing to, pump the crowd up to waving. I don't mind at the beginning of the fight or in between rounds, I mean, it's all fair game, but he was doing that also quite a bit in the Drew Dober fight. The guy fights with a lot of joy, a ton of spirit. He's vicious, but also has a kind of a gentlemanly almost side to him. When he first knocked down Melsik Bagdasaryan with that nasty, nasty two-piece combo, just a left hook and then a boom right down the middle, he could have followed up right there. I mean, clearly it didn't put Melsik Bagdasaryan to sleep, but he stood over him and was looking at the ref like look at him, right? Melsik Bagdasaryan pretty much in the fetal position, covering up. I don't know why, but that moment where he knocked him down with that vicious, vicious punch, sat him down quick, stood over him looking at the ref. It reminded me of Gladiator, the first Gladiator. Any of you that have seen Gladiator might remember the fight where Maximus is fighting this retired gladiator with all these accolades, and Caesar had brought him back out of retirement to fight Maximus because he thought he could defeat him. And Maximus had him dead to rights, and he lifts up his mask and he's kind of looking over at him, and he's got his weapon, and he's looking at him, and he just drops it. And at first you're kind of like, oh, he should have finished him, right? Which I know, of course, Gene Silva did, but he didn't want to. He was looking at the ref saying, hey, stop it. And it reminded me of when someone in the crowd during Gladiator, when Maximus was walking the way, someone screamed out, Maximus the Merciful, right? And because you can tell Gene Silva, he's a violent guy, but doesn't seem to like hurting people, right? He doesn't seem to like having to dish out any more than he needs to, even though he certainly can. And then the referee wasn't going to stop it, so what does he do? He hops on him, finishes him with some nasty elbows to the body and then a couple to the head, and then that's all she wrote. Gene Silva needs to fight someone in the top 15. I know he called out Bryce Mitchell after. I don't mind that call out. There's a lot going on with Bryce Mitchell right now. It's been well documented. We don't need to get into it. It made sense from a ranking standpoint that he would call out someone in the top 15. Frankly, I don't think that that's a competitive match. We've seen Bryce Mitchell against heavy strikers. We saw him against Ilia Topuria, and we're not going to hold that against him. I mean, he's fighting the current champion, right? Or at the time, right? He was a surging contender guy that carries heavy power. He finished Bryce Mitchell. And then, of course, need I remind you all about when Bryce Mitchell fought Josh Emmett and what Josh Emmett did to him. I mean, that was one of the most vicious, violent knockouts I've ever seen. Had Bryce Mitchell on the ground, like convulsing, like he was seizuring. That doesn't happen a ton in MMA. We see knockouts all the time. We see TKOs. We see refs step in to prevent damage. But that was a vicious, vicious shot that Josh Emmett gave Bryce Mitchell. It seems like Bryce Mitchell has responded via X that he is interested in the Gian Silva fight. He is interested in fighting the Lord Silva. If Bryce Mitchell wants to first hold on to his ranking, if he wants to be involved in any kind of relevant discussion within any kind of top 10, top 5, or any kind of future title implications, it would be very, very wise of him to avoid Gene Silva. If he fights Gene Silva, he is going to get finished. I do not see a path to victory for Bryce Mitchell. I know we talk about the grappling and the wrestling component. I just don't think that's going to be enough. I don't think that's a competitive fight. Based on what we've seen against big, heavy strikers, Bryce Mitchell struggles with them. So I do not think it would be wise for Bryce Mitchell to take that fight. I know he's a tough guy. He's got a lot of pride. He is a guy that doesn't back down from a challenge. I mean, look at the guys he's fought, right? I mean, he's fought just killers. But I do not think that that's a competitive fight. Gene Silva, and if that fight happens, I mean, you can come back to this video if they do indeed book that fight. Gene Silva will absolutely work Bryce Mitchell. He will work Bryce Mitchell like an after-school job. That is not a competitive fight, and I personally, and we're just playing fantasy matchmaking here. I know that there's guys already booked, there's already fights planned and so forth. We're just playing, fantasy matchmaking here. I would like to see Gian Silva against someone with some heavy hands in the featherweight division, somebody that's in the top 10 or at least top 15. I wouldn't mind seeing him against a Calvin Kattar. Calvin Kattar is a guy that is notoriously hard to finish, a guy that's been involved in some wars. I mean, you think back to the Giga Chikadze fight. You think back to the Max Holloway fight. I mean, he was taking some big shots. And I know he lost the Max Holloway fight, and he beat Giga Chikadze as a significant underdog in that fight. But he showed toughness. He showed grit. He took some early heavy shots from Giga Chikadze, both to the body and to the head. He's showed he's got the goods. He's as tough as can be, and I think that fight bangs. I think that that's a great fight, and I want to see Gian Silva tested. I want to see him respond to getting rocked a little bit, to getting cut open a little bit, to facing some adversity. Because up to this point, he has faced little to no adversity, and I think Calvin Kattar is the recipe to provide him with some of that. Bryce Mitchell, stay far away from Gian Lord Silva. That guy is coming on. And we talk about the fighting nerds all the time. They've made a big splash, particularly in the last year or two. I'm not predicting this, I'm not picking this, but is it crazy? Is it crazy to think that we could live in a world where eventually we see a Kyle Baraglio as a champion? A world where we also see Carlos Prates as a champion? And now, especially with Ilya moving up to lightweight, is it crazy to think that one day we could see Gian Lord Silva as a featherweight champion? Mauricio Hufi, I still have some questions about Mauricio Hufi. Not to say he doesn't have the goods. Clearly, the guy's super talented. I still have some questions about him, especially at lightweight. I mean, lightweight is just so stacked. But so are the other divisions, to be fair. But it's not crazy to think that. I mean, the Fighting Nerds team, man, they have assembled some guys that are a lot to reckon with. These guys are willing dance partners that love violence, that will go in there and mix it up with the best. I'm looking forward to see what happens with the Fighting Nerds. I picked Gian Silva to win by knockout in the first round. That's exactly what happened. So great to see him get a win, but it's time. It's time to see him tested, legitimately tested with somebody in the top 15 minimum. I wouldn't even mind seeing him against someone in the top 10 at this point. Moving on. Anthony Fluffy Hernandez got it done against Brendan Allen. I also picked Anthony Hernandez to win this fight. I did not know coming into the fight that he had been struggling with some sort of sickness that required some antibiotics. I think he was the last one to make weight. I know there was some concern, like, when they announced that Anthony Hernandez was still trying to make weight, and he was the last one attempting to weigh in, and I think he finally weighed in. There were still 40 minutes left, but eventually made weight. But you did have some concerns with that. What kind of shape is he in? What's going on? Why is it so hard for him to make weight? But a guy that once again proved that he's got the goods, proved that he can weather an early storm, and put on a great performance, even in the midst of a sickness. Brendan Allen had some moments in that fight where he made some poor decisions. Particularly, I want to go back to the second round. Brendan Allen had him hurt. I believe it was the second round. He had Anthony Hernandez on the retreat, on the feet, and I believe he was kind of shielding an eye and kind of like doing this to try to create some distance from Brendan Allen. And Brendan Allen decided that he was going to try to, I think he tried to jump on his back and work a submission. Not smart. Not smart. And he has stated this before in interviews that he takes a lot of pride in finishing guys on the ground, finishing guys with submissions. He feels like it's a truer test and a bigger badge of honor to finish guys with submissions rather than on the feet. It shows that he won the chess match. It shows that he's the better grappler and submission artist. But you do that, you're going into Anthony Hernandez's world. I mean, that's where he lives. That's where he does his best work. And he had an opportunity there. The fight was still, could have been anyone's fight at that point, but the more it went to the ground, in my mind, the more it favored Anthony Hernandez. I thought Brendan Allen should have tried to mix it up on the feet a little bit more, and he did. He had some success on the feet. As where Anthony Hernandez, we know he's not a natural striker. He's a guy that can strike. He's not a guy that's going to get too many finishes on the feet. He is a wrestler, grappler. He looks for finishes on the ground. He looks to work into his submissions. That's his bread and butter. That's his superpower. As it is Brendan Allen, but he showed that even in the midst of dealing with a sickness, he can still get it done. Anthony Hernandez, kind of becoming a bit of a dark horse contender for a title shot, kind of sneaking up in there. He's a guy that we haven't really talked about, but he's becoming a viable dark horse contender in the title picture, in my opinion. I'm not saying he gets there. I think he's going to struggle a bit when he gets to the top 5, if he gets to the top 5. But, you know, anytime you get a guy like this, it's fun to throw him into the mix when we're playing some of the fantasy matchmaking. Because make no mistake about it, even if he doesn't make it all the way into the title picture, he is a guy that can give any of those guys problems, particularly on the ground. You go to the ground with Anthony Hernandez, you are in his world. You're in Fluffy's world, and he is going to put on that wet blanket for the entire fight. That's what he's going to do to you, and that's by and large what he did to Brendan Allen. He moves up ahead of over Brendan Allen, presumably in the rankings, and I'm looking forward to see what happens next with Anthony Hernandez. He is a guy now that should be fighting guys in the top 10 and top 5 to get those litmus tests. So great win for Fluffy. Looking forward to seeing what happens next, what they do with the matchmaking for him. And then guys, we get to our main event. Song Yadong against Henry Cejudo. A fight that was looking great until it wasn't. Of course, we're going to get to the elephant in the room, guys. We're going to discuss the eye poke and what that led to and kind of what transpired in between when Henry was trying to recover. But prior to that, I thought both guys looked good. I thought it was a competitive fight. I did think that Song was landing the heavier shots. I did think that by and large he was winning the rounds. But Henry came to fight. Henry did come to fight. He landed some heavy shots, but the issue was that whatever Henry landed, Song landed right back. If he got one, he was going to give one back. And that's how Song fights. He is a guy that wants violence. He welcomes it. He wants all the smoke. He wants to bang. We saw that in the Petr Yan fight when he was actively, doing this, like, come on, come on, come on, hit me, right? He is a guy that believes that he is tougher than his opponent, that he can dish it out harder than it can be given to him. He is a guy that looks for finishes. Didn't get it in this one. I mean, not really, right? I mean, we had the doctor stoppage ultimately. But both guys were landing big shots. We have a Henry Cejudo, a 38-year-old now Henry Cejudo, that gets introduced as an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling, which he has that. Where was that? MMA Guru had an interesting take after the Tatiana Suarez and Zhang Weili fight about American, and he was very specific about American wrestling credentials and about how by and large they just don't seem to mean the same thing as these guys coming over from Dagestan, other parts of Russia, Kazakhstan, Georgia. That the credentials just don't seem to mean the same as it relates to success in mixed martial arts. And then it kind of got me thinking, because it's true, we had a Tatiana Suarez who, and I'm not going to get into that fight a whole lot, but I'm just connecting the dots here. But we had a Tatiana Suarez who we just heard ad nauseum about her wrestling credentials, everything she's accomplished, from the time she was a child to an adult, everything in between, and about how she was going to dominate Zhang Weili on the ground, that she was the female Habib. And then we had Zhang Weili, who's never had a wrestling match, was able to only get taken down once, and by and large was able to negate all those takedown attempts. And after that, it kind of got me thinking, like, do we think of these American wrestling MMA fighters the same way we think about these guys from Dagestan, from Georgia, from Kazakhstan, these guys that just have this vicious, relentless wrestling and grappling that give you that wet blanket treatment? And I know Henry Cejudo's 38, but you would think that a guy with all of the accolades, all of the credentials of a Henry Cejudo, it wasn't even a factor in this fight. It was not even a significant part of any round. He was able to get in on some single legs, but Song either bucked him off or Henry just kind of let it go. So this was a stand-up affair. And I thought you could have scored the rounds either way. Upon first watch, again, I gave the rounds to Song. But this was a competitive fight. Make no mistake about it. But as we started getting into the later second round, the third round, I think Henry realized that this was going to be a challenging fight for him to win, especially when the threat of the takedown is pretty much not there anymore. So we get to the eye poke. There's been a lot of talk about if there should have been a point deduction from the eye poke. Many people that believe that preface that with the thought of the first two groin strikes. Guys, I went back and I watched that fight several times. The first groin strike clearly hit the inner thigh. It was not a groin strike. I know Henry was looking at the ref like, hey, come on, he hit my groin, come on. You know, the first one absolutely was not. I've rewatched the fight 3 times now. it wasn't a groin strike. The second groin strike, while it was much closer and might have grazed the cup a little bit, to me, it seemed to be off to the side. This was not these heavy groin shots that we've seen guys that just come straight up the middle with the front kicks, and you can hear it too. You can hear the difference when it hits the shorts or skin, or when it really comes in contact with that cup. I didn't think there were groin strikes personally upon review of the fight several times. I mean, the eye poke, no question. It was a bad eye poke. It was a terrible eye poke. Make no mistake about it. And now there's a lot of discussion happening about what happened when the fight was stopped, when Henry was getting the 5 minutes, what happened when the 5 minutes was up, what happened before the fourth round started. And you had a Henry Cejudo that was granted the 5 minutes. And he took all 5 minutes. And to his, in all fairness, that's what he should have done. I wish more guys would do that. Because how often have we seen a guy that either sustains a legitimate groin strike or a bad eye poke, and they want to be tough and they want to show that, hey, no, I can take it, I can get back in there and beat this guy, and then the opponent just blitzes them and gets a quick finish. I wish more guys would take the 5 minutes that they're allowed, because the rules state that they can take that time. So no knock against him at all. For taking that. He should take the 5 minutes. He was verbally saying to Jason Herzog that he wanted to continue. He said, I want to keep fighting. I want to keep fighting. I want to keep fighting. But while also stating that he couldn't see out of one of the eyes. When the round ended, he went to his corner and he kept telling his corner very loudly, I can't see. I can't see. I can't see. But while also telling Jason Herzog, I want to keep going. I want to keep going. So, if you haven't rewatched this fight, I encourage you to do so, because there are some moments in between the third and the fourth that, in my mind, kind of tell the story of kind of where Henry Cejudo's head was, what he was thinking going into the fourth. There were some interactions between, I can't remember if it was his corner or the doctor, and even I think after the fight was announced, when he was trying to explain, he made some reference to the point that it was, I think, his right eye. I think it was his right eye. No, forgive me. There was one eye that he was saying that he couldn't see out of, that it was, he was seeing double vision. I was like, I'm seeing 3 of him, or something to that effect. Hey guys, sorry about that. Had to take care of my dogs. Got 4 of them. Had to get them a little settled down. Anyway, back to the Henry Cejudo Song Yadong fight. In the middle of that contest, into the third round, going into the fourth round, we had Henry Cejudo, who was telling his corner that he could not see. Could not see. Could not see. But at certain points, between the rounds, and even after the fight, he made reference to the fact that it was one of his eyes. That, I know it was a double eye poke, but clearly one of them had sustained more damage than the other. And there was one eye he was particularly complaining more about, to his corner, to the doctor, and after the fight. So this is a little hard for me, because we can get into what he was thinking about as far as, well, if I call it off now, will it go to a no contest? Or was he thinking, oh, if he did it after the fact, that the result would change? Or who knows, right? Only he knows. But this is what I'm going to say about this. So first, we have Henry Cejudo, who has not won a fight since 2020. He's 38 years old. I know he likes to say he's 38 years young. He made a point in telling I think it was Bisping, after after the fight was called off. Um, I think it was Bisping, or might have been, I don't know. He was telling Bisping, "I'm 38 years young. I'm 38 years young." He is having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that he is not the Henry Cejudo that we saw in 2020 at the peak of his powers. The Henry Cejudo from 2020, I think, continues in that fight. I do think there was a little self-realization in the middle of that fight of, wow, I can't get my takedowns. Yeah, I'm dishing it out pretty well to this guy, but he's giving it back to me pretty good. He's landed some heavy shots. And if I can't get this guy to the ground, well, I don't know. What does that mean? He absolutely, desperately needed this win to stay in any kind of title implication hopes. And I know that sounds crazy, but he seems to continue to find ways to keep himself relevant enough to be in that conversation when it comes to the top five, even like title implications. A finish over Song Yadong might have put him back into that conversation, but he was faced with the fact in the middle of that fight that he can't implement his superpower, the takedown. The American wrestling expert, the Olympic gold medalist, could not find a way to take down a Song Yadong who has very little wrestling background. I think after a while that started to frustrate Henry. The commentators have made note of this before during fights where guys start complaining to the referee too much when they start asking for points to be taken away. He was actively asking Jason Herzog, you need to take away a point, you need to take away a point. For me, it just oozed frustration. That's what I kind of was seeing from Henry Cejudo. I saw a guy that was frustrated he couldn't implement his plan A. I saw a guy that was frustrated that he was getting cracked the way that he was. Not that he wasn't giving it back to him, because he was. But I saw a guy that was desperate to find an answer. When I was listening to Henry talk about his eye, about how he couldn't see out of his eye. Oh, I can't, I see three of him, right? And he was very specific that it was one of his eye. He didn't say, oh, both eyes are done, both eyes are cooked, I can't see it all. He said it was one eye. Now, if it was both eyes that he was complaining about, or saying, oh, I can't see out of both eyes, they're both, uh, I'm seeing double, seeing triple, both eyes. Okay. He was very specific that it was one of his eyes that he couldn't see out of. And I don't know why, because there's many examples of this, but I thought back to a fight from last year that didn't involve any eye pokes that I can recall, but it reminded me of one of Song's teammates, Mektebek Oralbai. If any of you remember last year, he was involved in a violent fight against Mateusz Rebecki. In that fight, Mektebek Oralbai sustained some vicious blows to his right eye. He was circling into Rebecki's power. And if any of you remember that fight, his right eye was cooked. That thing was done like dinner. That thing was just swollen shut. It was huge, clearly a broken orbital of some sort. It was rough. It was incredibly rough. If it's just an issue of being able to see out of one eye and not being able to see out of the other, we see that all the time. How many times have we seen guys with broken orbitals, guys that have eyes that are just swollen shut, guys that just look like, I mean, two different versions of themselves from one side of their face to the other, or guys that get both eyes swelled up. But if we're just talking about one eye right now. Clearly, Muktabek Oralbai probably couldn't see that well out of that eye. The other eye was good. Henry was pretty much saying after the fight to the doctor, "Oh, it's this eye. This eye is good, but I can't see out of this eye." I ask you guys this. What's the difference? What's the difference between a Muktabek Oralbai whose eye probably sustained more damage than Henry's did, continuing with the fight? Now again, if it's both eyes, sure. But I'm just telling you what he was telling anyone within arm's reach, explaining to people, "Oh, it's this eye. I'm seeing three, but this eye is good. But it's this one. It's this one." Okay, well, how often do we see guys continue fighting with one eye? And is it his right to stop the fight? Absolutely, it absolutely is. But again, that goes back to my point of, does the Henry from 2020 continue with that fight? I think he does. I think this is a Henry Cejudo that is having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that he is not what he once was. Still a dangerous fighter, still can win fights. But I think his days in the title picture are pretty much over. Dana White did not seem to be too convinced post-fight that he couldn't have continued. He seemed to be he shrugged off the idea of a rematch. I think one reporter asked specifically, "Hey, is this one that you'd like to see again?" Both guys said that they wanted it, and Dana emphatically said, "No, I don't need to see that fight again." I don't know that they're going to be doing Henry Cejudo too many more favors after this. If they make the rematch, hey, great. I don't think that that's a bad fight to run back, but I think Song showed enough in that fight to show that he still has the goods. He needs to learn some head movement. Song is a dangerous fighter, but he relies too much on out-toughing his opponents. Yeah, you can hit me because I'm going to hit you back harder. Well, that can work in the 7 to 10 range, certainly the 10 to 15 range caliber fighters, or even a Henry Cejudo. But you start getting into guys in the top 5, it's just not going to be enough to out-tough them. And that showed in the Petr Yan fight. That showed in the Corey Sandhagen fight. You're going to need to mix it up a little bit more. I think he has some great coaches from Team Alpha Male. Uriah Faber and crew always get their fighters ready. I mentioned a shout out, a salute to Muktabek Oralbai from that vicious fight from last year. Those guys always come to fight, 100%. But if Song is going to make some noise, and he's still got time, he's still a young guy, he's got time to polish his game. But my big takeaway for Song is, while it looked impressive, he's got all the goods, he's got all the skills he needs, but he does need to polish up. If he is going to rely primarily on stand-up to be his path to victory, he's got to learn some better head movement. He has to learn to avoid taking some of these huge damaging shots and potentially mixing it up a little bit more on the ground. But solid showing from Song, and I did pick Song to win this fight. Where does Henry go from here? I don't know. He was calling for the rematch. It doesn't sound like Dana's going to grant him that rematch. So now what? Because he still seems to very much believe that he is a guy that can compete for a championship. Again, I just don't see that in the cards for him. Prior to this fight, there was some discussion of him potentially wanting to go down to flyweight to challenge Alexandre Pantoja, the flyweight champ. I don't think that that's in the cards for Henry. I don't think was in the cards for Henry before this fight. First of all, he's 38, and at face value, 38 years old, at flyweight and at bantamweight. I mean, it's just incredibly, incredibly hard to make any kind of noise when you have that kind of age and that kind of mileage on you. And not to mention, took the time off when he did at the peak of his powers. He has clearly taken a step back. I'm not saying it's a huge step back, but when you get into the top 10, top 5, that little step back is going to make the biggest difference in the world. Now, going back to the idea of him fighting the flyweight champ, Alexandre Pantoja. I know that Pantoja has done a great job clearing out this division. I know that they recently announced Pantoja versus Kai Kara-France, which I think is a great fight. I think that Kai Kara-France is deserving of that opportunity. I think if Henry Cejudo were to drop to flyweight, and in a crazy world where they would grant him that opportunity, which, hey, crazier things have happened, right? And this is a guy that I mentioned seems to be pretty desperate to hold on to those title contention hopes of any kind. So now does he rethink, oh, well, maybe if I drop to flyweight, they're going to give me a shot at Pantoja, cleaned out the division, they're looking for some fresh matchups. Crazier things have happened, guys. But a 38-year-old Henry Cejudo making that weight cut to 125, that's going to be a big challenge on its own. What kind of shape does he show up in on fight night? I think his body would be pretty depleted. And I feel pretty good in saying that I don't think that that fight with Alexandre Pantoja, and we're playing fantasy matchmaking here, guys, but I don't see that as a competitive fight. Henry from 5 years ago? Absolutely. I might even pick him to win. And I love Alexandre Pantoja. But Henry Cejudo, the current version of Henry Cejudo, fighting Alexandre Pantoja, who is currently at the peak of his powers, a guy that is slowly inching himself more and more with each victory into the flyweight GOAT conversation. And I'm not saying he is. It's still DJ. Let's be clear. DJ is the flyweight GOAT currently. But with every victory that Pantoja is getting, he is inching himself more and more and more closer into that flyweight GOAT conversation. Alexandre Pantoja does whatever he wants to him. Let's be very clear. That's not a competitive matchup at all. On the feet, I think he'll mix it up with him nice. Pantoja, a guy that can mix it up with dirty boxing. We saw that in the Moreno fight. Knocked him down in the first round, jumped right on him quick, continued with vicious elbows. He is also a guy that will jump at any opportunity to take you down and to implement his ground game, which is world class. When someone was talking about this hypothetical matchup, I couldn't help thinking about when Davison Figueiredo fought Joseph Benavidez and sent him into retirement. I don't think that this fight, if it would happen or if it does happen, goes much differently. I think that Pantoja does whatever he wants to Henry Cejudo, this version of Henry Cejudo, especially over the course of 5 rounds. Alexandre Pantoja will beat him up on the feet, will beat him up on the ground, and leave with Henry Cejudo's heart, like a cannibal does. The cannibal, the champion, Alexandre Pantoja. I don't see them granting him that fight, but if they do, it's going to be a long night for Henry Cejudo. That's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching the first episode of MMA After Dark. Like and subscribe, and I will see you in the coming week. We have UFC Fight Night. Manel Kape back in action. A guy that could make some noise. Is he the next flyweight contender? Is he the next guy that's going to fight for the belt? Well, we got to wait and see. I'll have breakdowns of all those fights, predictions, and potential implications for any potential outcomes. Thanks for watching, guys. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next time on MMA After Dark.